We have just completed a pilot study that's researching near-death experiences or extrasensory experiences with children aged between, I think it's 6 and 18. Some of these children have actually died 2 or 3 times in ICU and have been resuscitated. Some of the most reported experiences are things like engaging with beings that other people can't see, and not imaginary friends. These are beings of all different shapes and sizes. They described a darkness. It was always this loving, loving darkness. They'll move through tunnels, and they don't call them tunnels, they say spirals, which is really interesting. They move through spirals. They see a light at the end, but it's this loving darkness, this sense of going home. I think what the research suggests is that, the brain doesn't produce consciousness or subjective experience, and I think that children's experiences, certainly for me, show that. For analytical idealism, the idea is that reality itself is this field of subjectivity. We ask people about themselves, but we don't ask what is self. We don't look at children when we think about consciousness. And when we ask these huge metaphysical questions, and we all forget that we were once children and that we may have been experiencing this in a very, very different way, but we've had it programmed out of us.
Donna, thank you very much for coming for this interview. Welcome to the Netherlands.
Thank you.
You have a PhD in linguistics, and currently you are co-director of iCreate's International Research Unit at the University of Central Lancashire.
Yeah.
And much of your research focuses on the study of extrasensory experiences in children and young people. You have written a book about this. We will talk about it later. I wonder, what was it that led you to do research with children with unexplained extrasensory experiences?
Thank you. It's a really good question. So it was really a convergence of my own personal living experiences with work that I was doing, my career, which was very much based around research with children and ensuring that services for children, such as education and health, were involving children in service design. So it was those two things that converged. It might make more sense if I start with my own childhood experiences, which really informs the work that I do now. I've had 2 significant childhood, what we'd refer to as extrasensory experiences, and by extrasensory I mean these are experiences that come outside of our typical notions of being an individual person in the world, time and space. So they're experiences that kind of go beyond those things. And when I was 5, I was actually run over by a huge motorbike. It was actually a Harley Davidson, and it ran me clean over. And at the point of impact, I found myself up high, looking up and down the street, seeing the little boy across the road. We'd been like fighting with each other and pulling faces, and he'd been doing this, and all of a sudden he was kind of like this, because from his perception, I'd been hit by this motorbike, but I didn't feel it because I was actually up out the body and looking around the street. So that was the first experience that I had, and that was quite young.
Sort of out-of-body experience.
It was
what
an
we call now,
yeah,
right?
I guess, yeah, like an out-of-body experience. And of course, as a 5-year-old, that could have been really normal. We don't question that, and then life continues. And then at the age of 15, I was involved in a very serious car crash. The car began to turn and turn. The driver was going much too fast. It began to flip over like this. And ultimately it crashed into a wall, and it was upside down, and it was on fire, and we were all trapped inside, so it was quite frightening. And again, that was the appearance from the outside. Inside for me, as the car started to turn, I had this huge, intense fear, and this thought that, well, the thought was, I'm going to die, this is it. And all of a sudden that fear melted away and I was no longer in the car. I'm not quite sure where I was. Importantly, I wasn't quite sure what I was, because I'd expanded and was feeling myself to be so much more than this child, than this 15-year-old girl, and felt this incredible peace and this incredible love. And there were no lights and there was kind of nothing fancy there. It was this darkness, but it was very womb-like, like a loving darkness. And then in that moment, I started to have what we would consider as a life review. So I saw every single nuance and moment of my very short life, because I was only 15, and it just flashed. And it felt like forever, but it felt like no time too. So I was okay. The ambulance came and I wasn't badly injured. Some of the passengers were quite injured, but I was very lucky. The problems arose. So for 2 weeks after that, I was in this state of peace, and people were coming to visit me at home, and I was like loving everybody, even people I really didn't like before. I was just full of love for everybody and very peaceful. And then 2 weeks I was fine. I had to go back to school, and that's when the issues began for me, because I was still then having these expansive type experiences where I'd feel myself all of a sudden not kind of in the body and expanding and expanding. And I started to withdraw from people because, you know, integration after an experience like that can be really challenging. And one of the reasons it's so challenging, as a society, we're not equipped to deal with these kinds of experiences. We don't talk about them. If we are aware of them, we don't do anything about them, or we'll categorize them as, well, it's just disassociation, or it's PTSD, or it's, but it wasn't just that. It was having this knowing about yourself as a 15-year-old child that there is just far more to this, and you can't understand why the world is working the way it is. It doesn't, nothing seems to feel right in that. So as time progressed, I pushed it all away because I couldn't deal with it, again, because there was nothing to support that. And I guess to cope with my pain and trauma, not just from the accident, you know, I had a very difficult childhood. You know, I'm the daughter of an alcoholic, of a parent with an addiction. So there was lots of trauma there too, and it was trying to navigate that. So to do that, I built myself this big armor through academia and career, because I thought that would just make it all go away and I don't have to think about or be with what happened, and I can have some kind of life. And I got a career in local government, so I've worked in kind of local government contexts where I managed research. Again, this is where the work comes in. It was all about getting services to recognise the importance of people's living experiences when they are designing things like health or education or whatever the service is. So that's where these two things start to then converge. So I'd built this, like this egoic armour and this career, and this is what I'm going to do. Studied linguistics and thought about, you know, how does language make the world work? You know, what role does discourse play? And for me, I started to think, well, everything's discursive. There's nothing, there's only language, there's only discourse. So I was also a hardcore constructionist at this point too. But I couldn't continue to keep covering what had happened. And then around 10 years ago, I started to kind of enter into this, what we'd call maybe a dark night of the soul, where the cracks started to open and everything started to seep out, and memories of being young and what happened in the accident, and it just wouldn't leave me alone, and I couldn't cover it anymore. And
you had to process it.
It broke.
You had to process, deal with it, yeah.
Well, it was all of a sudden, I will share this bit of the story. It got so bad that I decided I couldn't live with myself anymore. And one day I decided I wasn't going to live with myself and wanted to end it all, and planned to take tablets and to have done with all this. And as I was moving towards doing this, something just happened again where it was almost a repeat of what happened when I was 15, that something pushed through, and again I expanded, and I just expanded, and I felt that love and that peace, and of course that was it. I was okay. And then from that moment, you know, me as a 15-year-old, I pushed it and didn't want it and needed to integrate. And me, you know, as an older woman was, I need to know what this is. You know, what is this? What is this? I recognise this as me. This is a truer version of me, but I need to know more about this. So I started to explore what that was through listening to people, listening to spiritual teachers, and then finding academics that were actually talking about this, but more in a more scientific and academic way. So then I converged linguistics and my research with children with, okay, we're going to explore this now, and that's how the work began.
So Donna, that experience actually led you to do research with children, right? You always emphasize that with children and not on children.
Yeah,
Why do you think it's so important with children?
Yeah, so when children are invited into research, which isn't that often, especially in fields such as the hard sciences or health, and sometimes even in fields such as education, which is very child-centred, children are not often invited into research, and that's because they're viewed as incapable of taking part. They're not really seen as knowers of knowledge. They're always kind of seen as becoming adult rather than a being in their own right. And then often when we do bring children into research, we are researching on them, and we're positioning children as these passive objects or passive subjects, and rather than active agents. And that's the difference. So it's the kind of partners in research. That's the difference between with and on.
Mm-hmm. And kids feel it, I think. I would imagine they feel it, or not?
Absolutely.
It's being a subject or being a partner in research, I think that's...
When you make a child a research partner, they come to life. Mm-hmm. You know, that creativity is flowing, their ideas are flowing. I mean, they will tell you things that you've not even considered before you've started the research. And there's lots of ways we do involve children in research. So they can be co-designers. So children can come in right at the beginning of a research project and help you to design that research and think about who might participate in that, you know, help to bring participants in, other children. And you can train children to do qualitative research. And then we do things such as peer research, where, as we're speaking now, you might have two children, with one of them, the researcher, asking another child a question. And again, that's amazing, that dynamic between children and that level of information that can come. So there's all different kinds of ways to involve children in research.
But how, practically speaking, how does your research look like? What do you do, actually, with kids?
Real research.
Yeah.
So it depends on the project. So, and there's always a degree of agency for children depending on, and it might be best to give examples rather than to explain a specific. Well, it's qualitative research. So it's the idea that it's epistemological authority of people, so they are knowers of their own, they are experts in their own living experience. And in qualitative research, that's kind of the primary data. Now, in traditional qualitative research, and even that carries this, it's underpinned by this kind of logical empiricism, and because historically qualitative research had to fight to be seen as a proper science, as real research. It had to be seen as rigorous. But the consequence of that is then we have to try and measure human experience, measure the immeasurable, something that, you know, we can't really take those kinds of scientific methodologies and put them onto subjective, living, fluid experiences of human beings. So, you know, as a response to that, this is why these kind of non-traditional research methodologies came around, because it was to challenge that idea of that traditional research. And what that means is that it can be more creative. We can place value on different kinds of knowledges. rather than just that one scientific, numerical, statistical. That's one knowledge, but that's knowledge that carries value. But in reality, there are a range of different knowledges, a range of different ways that people represent that knowledge. So for a child, you know, they're not going to write you an essay, or but they may draw a picture, and that's a knowledge, and it's a form of representation. So we use creative methodologies, but we can also use traditional too, and that all depends. So in some of the studies, an example is we have just completed a pilot study that's researching near-death experiences or extrasensory experiences with children aged between, I think it's 6 and 18, in an intensive care unit. So the purpose of this research, again, is that things don't work very well for families in intensive care units, because from their perspective, doctors don't listen to what they want and need. It's very kind of cold, and again, we're back to measuring this, but there's so much more going on in an intensive care unit, especially when a child is near to death. So the way we'd set up that project is that we have to go through very rigorous research ethics that can take 18 months. We have to design a methodology. So we can't do verbal interviews with some of these children. So that's when we bring in methods such as art and play and bring that in so that we can ask questions with children and their parents if they're very young. You know, we have 3 magic questions actually. So some of these children have actually died 2 or 3 times in ICU and have been resuscitated. So we'll ask, you know, what happened before you fell asleep or lost consciousness? What happened when you woke up? And then kind of the killer question, what happened in the middle? Because that's kind of a question that we wouldn't think to ask, because they're unconscious or they've died, or and children report things that have been happening that are very similar, for example, to near-death experiences.
And what was the most interesting case that you came across during your research?
There's so many interesting cases. I think my favourite experiences are these transcendental type experiences, and these are the experiences that I am really, really interested in, simply because they might tell us things about consciousness or self that we might not be able to get from just researching some of the other kinds of experiences, such as telepathy or you know, many children in my study, some of the most reported experiences are things like engaging with beings that other people can't see, and not imaginary friends. These are beings of all different shapes and sizes. So some that apparently look like people, some that look like animals, some that look really strange and that they can't really describe, but they can draw. So they see a whole range of beings that other people can't see. And the other one is out-of-body experiences. That is, we always have a real high incidence of children reporting out-of-body experiences. So the transcendental ones are my favourite, and I think what blows me away is when one that really sticks in my mind again, and maybe because it resonates with me so much, is there was a young girl and she'd had a suicide attempt. Yes, it was very, very sad. And while in hospital and recovering, she had an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She began to look around the ward and look at the other young people and recognise that, you know, their lives might be much more worse than hers. And then she had this gratitude, and then all of a sudden she talked about expanding and, you know, recognising there's so much more and feeling so much love. And what she reported was when she left hospital, she'd actually been on medication for depression for quite a long time. She stopped it immediately and she never went back to it. So for me, that's an example of how some of these experiences might also generate some kind of self-healing or well-being for children. But because we don't research them, because they're seen as woo-woo, you know, we don't know that, and we need to know that, because we have a mental health system, a global children's mental health system that is collapsing. And part of that reason is because children are constantly diagnosed and referred to these systems, not even for experiences such as I can hear a voice or I can see someone and you can't, for feeling unhappy, for a feeling of unhappiness or for suffering. So if we go back to your question about why is it important to research with children, we don't do that. And we need to be with children to learn about these experiences, to inform services that are meant to support children, but also in the wider context, maybe so we can learn more about consciousness, because that's a very adult-led field and normally a very scientific or philosophical field, especially in the neurosciences when it comes to children. And again, children are missing from that area of research. So that's why we should research with them too.
What are the typical research questions you aim at answering? What would you like to?
It's very tricky. So an example is if I'm researching with a group of 4 and 5 year olds. I mean, we're running a very big national project at the minute, and we're trying to explore these extrasensory experiences across various cultural contexts, because again, we want to look at our cultural narratives and, you know, if a child reports an experience, how might they be responded to from a cultural perspective? You know, is it our Western, our modern Western narrative where, yeah, that's impossible, or there's something not quite right? Or, you know, in our country, we have many different cultures who think about these in very different ways. So, you know, as part of that research. So one of the research groups, there were 4 and 5 year olds. Well, you know, how do you go into a group of 4 and 5 year olds and say, okay, have you had a weird experience?
Out of body
experience. And they'll go, yes, I had a wee infection. Okay. Yes, I went on holiday, because these are unusual experiences for very young children, especially children who might not get to go on holiday. So then you're like, okay, so how do we navigate this? So, for example, one of the tools we've made is a storybook. So I've wrote a little book where it's taken from children's actual experiences and put it into a character. So with the very young ones, I'll read some of that story and say, okay, have you had anything happen like that? And then they will just draw that, or they will talk about that, or we'll have toys and we'll play that experience out, and we'll try to capture things in that way. And it's amazing what younger children will start to reveal when you do that. You know, it's very hard to avoid things like bias, but we try it so much, you know, and that's exactly why, you know, we have to have this storybook, so we're not going in and saying, have you done this? Have you done this? Because of course children will say, yes, I have. And especially if they're in a school context, because they have to be right. So there's all these nuances that we have to think about when we're researching with children, which can make it more difficult actually than researching with adults too. We're always trying to, you know, it's about rigor, and these words like validity. And this comes back to what I was saying about qualitative research in its traditional sense, was always trying to achieve and try to show that this is valid because, you know, 1,000 people have said this. And even when you do that, it's still not considered real science because it's anecdotal, or it's just what people say and it's just subjective. But well, what do we mean by subjective and objective? What do we mean by this even? Because of course now in science it's showing that even in a lab, our subjective experience, our agency may in some way be imposing and impacting on that experiment. And in some ways, when you do qualitative research with children, you are so reflexive that you have to come and look at all your narratives here and your research agendas and the power relationships. So basically, you're discerning, you're being mindful, you're being reflexive, and you're looking at that when you're going into the research and you're trying to come at it from a more neutral space. But in a lab, you don't even do that. You've just really got an agenda and a theory. And of course, and I'm not slating science. I think science is incredible, you know, lab-based research, and it's all so important. But for trying to explore subjectivity or living experience, I think we need to, you know, to privilege and or complement with the qualitative. It's kind of a case for the qualitative. And children push us to do that even more because it's more difficult in a sense, and it brings these issues up to the fore.
But then what you're hoping to achieve with the research is to show that those experiences are real and valid, right? Or you have some additional questions you want to answer in terms of what is the nature of consciousness, for example. I mean, it's a crazy question.
I think what we're trying to show, we're not trying to say this is really real, because again, there's a whole ontological debate of what does real mean. I mean, one of the biggest questions I get asked, you know, if I'm giving a talk and they'll say, yeah, but you know, how do you know it's real? They're just kids, aren't they? And how do you know they're just imagination, and you know, how do you know it's real? And I'll say, well, what do you mean by reality? And can you tell me what you mean by imagination? Because for me, these are still areas of the mind that we know very, very little about. But when it comes to children, they're very boxed, and it's kind of that already adult theorized material that's used all the time to measure children. I think children have a really good sense of, for me, the research has a kind of a subjective validity. So for children, it's very real to them. So children will always say, this is realer than real sometimes. So it has a very subjective reality for children. It's really important in terms of these extrasensory experiences that we do research them and generate a new kind of narrative that can in some ways challenge this very, again, biomedical model. You know, children, this biomedical model, anything to do with children, especially in the UK, it's all these brain-based models. So, you know, everything's generated from the brain, which means if there's something happening with a child, the issue is residing within the biology of the child. You know, it's in the child, and it doesn't pay any attention to the social, the contextual, you know, but also what might be beyond that. We never really ask these ontological questions in social science either. We do to an extent, but then when it's research that's about social transformation, which is kind of the business that we're in, we ask people about themselves, but we don't ask what is self, you know, how do you experience that? We just immediately categorize people. So,
funny thing, I was talking to my mother 2 days ago, and I was telling her about, I'm gonna do this interview about this topic, and she was very interested. And I asked her, look, how was it when, you know, with your grandmother or grandmother, when, you know, we were living closer to nature at that time, you know, and kids were saying, yeah, I see a fairy or some, you know, spirit of the lake or spirit of the forest. And my mom said, yeah, so it was like this. So you see, so people just accept it. They said, yeah, but these days, if a child comes back and say he talks to a fairy every day, you know, the first question is there schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or some other thing? Yeah. And then my mom said, yeah, but at that time we didn't have so many psychologists, psychiatrists.
I mean, this is the kind of the social, cultural conditioning of adults, you know, who are responding to these experiences. And, you know, it's really challenging because as adults, we are socially conditioned. It's everything we do is influenced by language, by institutions. And, you know, even if we question that, we're seen as unusual or, and the other thing is we always seek the expert outside of ourselves, and especially where our children are concerned. And then the only experts there are kind of the medical experts. So, you know, it's very, very, very challenging. It's really challenging for a parent. You know, if a child says, right? You know, even me sometimes, my children have had these experiences, and I'll catch myself sometimes, they'll say, oh, Mum, this happened, and I'm like, secretly. But of course, I don't do that out there. It's kind of, okay, let's listen. Tell me about that. What does that mean to you? That's quite okay. lots and lots and lots of children and adults have these experiences. It's fine, you know, but you know, the knee-jerk, especially with voice hearing, we're just so conditioned and we have fear around it. And instead of kind of coming into our own knowledge that we've lost touch with, we're always seeking that outside expert, and it's always that biomedical model. So it's a circle. It's just a circle. So for me, this is partly why this research is important, but it's also challenging social research and social science a little bit with that who am I question. Because the research isn't just about these kinds of experiences, it's also about how do these experiences link to self, to how we experience ourselves, and what's that relationality between these experiences, self, and reality. Because again, in social science and in social research, everything is socially constructed. So there is nothing outside the social world. And again, that's really problematic because in the social world, we have social identities, we're in competition with each other, we're individuals, and the more that we are, you know, told that we are an individual, a woman, a homeless person, whatever category we're given, we take that and we shape our sense of self. Again, it's language, it's discourse, it shapes a sense of who we are.
Self-programming even, right? In a way as well.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
am this father, the mother, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Teacher.
Yeah. It's a bit like Michael Foucault talked about technologies of discourse across history and how, you know, powerful institutions with these languages and these narratives. And, you know, we take that in some sense, but it's this dialectical movement because as we're believing ourselves to be that, we're also shaping that bigger narrative as well. And it's always this movement. And it's very difficult to get out of. And I think that's why media have so much power and influence. And of course, they're all about the biomedical model and they're all about the material and yeah. So again, you know, we don't look at children when we think about consciousness. And when we ask these huge metaphysical questions, and we all forget that we were once children and that we may have been experiencing this in a very, very different way, but we've had it programmed out of us. So it's reminding the adults too, to some extent.
In your book, you laid very nicely various extrasensory or unexplained, you call them unexplained experiences, right? But in your research, what is the most common one in children that you came across?
Yeah.
Is it different from adults, the other thing?
Yeah, well, children have very similar experiences. When you look at the research in adult populations, children have very, very similar experiences. One of the differences is with near-death experiences that we're coming across. So the children in our study who report near-death experiences, they don't describe lots of kind of exciting content, let's just say. So where adults will meet lots of loved ones and may go here and do a bit of this and do a bit of that, the children who we were speaking to, they described a darkness. It was always this loving, loving darkness. They'll move through tunnels, and they don't call them tunnels, they say spirals, which is really interesting. They move through spirals, they see a light at the end, but it's this loving darkness, this sense of going home and this feeling of love. So there are similar features, but there's also, for me, this difference of this dark womb-likeness, which I'm really curious about and I find really, really interesting.
It's your own experience, actually, right? This love in darkness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting because, again, if we think about social conditioning, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, when adults have a near-death experience that it's completely influenced, you know, by everything we do in social life. I'm not suggesting that, but it is interesting how, you know, when adults have, you know, near-death experiences, there is a lot of content that resonates with their social character or with what they've been doing in life. But that's why it's so powerful with children. So, you know, 6-year-old children haven't read literature on near-death experiences and know that adults have reported moving through a tunnel and seeing a bright light at the end, but they're reporting that. So where does that knowledge come from? Well, it must be from experience. So, you know, for me, the NDEs are the most exciting, but there's very subtle ones too. So premonitions, children have lots and lots of premonitions, and also telepathy moments, and telepathy with knowing what others, with parents, absolutely, with loved ones.
Mother, child.
Yeah,
right?
but also with their close friends. So there's definitely a social grouping. But when they have those kinds of experiences, they'll also describe something embodied. So yeah, I can feel my friend's headache in my head, which isn't, it's very, very interesting. But for me, we can then ask questions, well, who are you in that moment then? You know, are you an individual person if you're having your friend's headache? And they'll say, well, no, I'm me and I'm her, all at the same time. So then we're getting another expression of self, which
Beautiful.
is a different layer of self, which is not an individual self. We call it a transpersonal self. That's how we're thinking about this at the minute, and it's all very embryonic still. But that's how we're thinking about that.
But what was your biggest aha moment? What, like, wow, from you know, on your path, because you had your own experiences, you've seen a lot of kids and lots of research. What really surprised you or took you off guard? You're so taken by it.
I've been taken off guard. Yeah, I was because you know many of these experiences can be really subtle from children. So really simple things like, I had a dream last night that I went to school and someone gave me a piece of Lego or some Lego, and it actually happened. So you know, it's very simple, it's really subtle. And when we're researching with groups of children, you'll hear many of these little instances of lucid dreams, or like, I know I'm dreaming, you know, and I can change my dream, and all these kinds of things. But I was in a group with 10 and 11-year-olds one day, and we'd done the exercise of, you know, can you draw anything that might be a little bit unusual, you know, out of the ordinary? And everyone's drawing these little experiences, and this one child, she had all the paints out, and she's just doing this, and then she's putting bits of glitter on. It was such a masterpiece. It was absolutely stunning when she'd finished. I said to her, you know, what's this that you're trying to represent? And she said, well, this is what someone showed me when they had died. They showed me the afterlife. And she proceeded to give me a tour of the afterlife from what she described as someone showed her what it's like when they had died, in the dying process. So it was this amazing picture, and she said that she had information from a dying person that this was the afterlife. So it was someone who had been in the dying process. And
a stranger or a family?
A stranger. Apparently, she said it was a dream. But interestingly, older children, they will start to talk about it in terms of dreams. And I think as they get older, they're very conscious of, I'm not sure I can talk about this because it's a bit weird or it's a bit strange, but dreams are actually a really safe topic for all children because we see them as so normal. And in this afterlife, there was a river, this huge river, and she was describing this process of, as we move down into this river, bits of who we are, such as memories. Basically, she was speaking about the contents of mind that were just kind of coming away until you get to this kind of all oneness kind of thing. So that really blew me away. It was a real curveball, and I just didn't know what to say to that. And normally I'll be like, you know, as you're doing this interview, you might be thinking about the next question. And research with children is very similar. It's very emergent in the sense of, you know, you have to be really responsive because you don't quite know what's going to happen. Anything can happen. They can hang off chairs. They can go missing when they go to the toilet. You know, you always have to be prepared. But this was this really blew me away. And Another one that blew me away was a little boy who was 5, and really sadly, his teacher died, and it was very sudden and unexpected, and he'd not been coping very well with that, as you can imagine. And he described a dream that he had where he met his teacher on what he described as a rainbow bridge. And his teacher said, she reassured him. She said, "I'm okay. I want you to start to feel happy again. I don't want you to worry anymore, and I'm okay." And then his mum reported that when he'd had that dream, he really, really improved. Now, what blew me away about that, of course, it's a great experience, and it's great that you hear about children feeling well again, but it was actually the rainbow bridge that blew me away, because this little boy was from a secular family. You know, there was no rich cultural stories around this child. But if you think about the rainbow bridge in terms of cultural mythologies, it's meant to be the place where you meet. I think it's the Hopi tribes maybe that talk about the rainbow bridge, and other communities, but it's where you're meant to meet your deceased loved ones. So that's what blew me away. So I would think, well, you know, how does such a young child tap into that knowledge? And it's a cultural knowledge as well. So it's gone across.
He couldn't have known.
It transcends histories. Any kind of cultural knowledge like that, you transcend in histories and times. And so that's fascinating to me. And I think that's the kind of data that I would like to research more. How we do that, I'm not sure. But one thing that I am doing at the minute is collecting children's abstract images. Because interestingly, when children have these kinds of experiences, again, that go beyond personhood, time, space, how we typically define it and think about it, they start to draw geometrical patterns. They can draw mandalas, they can draw geometrical patterns where lines are crisscrossing, but it's forming a pattern. And that they have no words sometimes to talk about their experiences, so they will doodle and they will start to do this. So I'm collecting these in a database now and asking questions. Well, you know, what is it? What are these patterns? Are they primordial to something? You know, why is it that these are the patterns that are being used by children to express this bigger sense of self, or these very unusual experiences that are going beyond our normal space and time, and these kinds of things? So I've been collecting those for a while, and that's really interesting. And we can, you know, look at that from kind of a semiotics perspective, for example, which is thinking about sign and signification. So, you know, what is this sign representing? Well, it doesn't seem to represent anything immediate in the social and cultural world of this child, but it's there. And interestingly, I've just, you know, completed a piece of research where we analysed canvases produced from 40,000 canvases produced by children. I did not analyse 40,000, but
alone.
This was part of a project. He was a Turner Prize winning artist, Oscar Murillo. I don't know if you've come across his fantastic work, but he did a project where in schools all over the world, he just put empty canvases down on the tables, and children were asked to do something called free marking. So free marking is where, you know, you're in school, but you're not asked to do something. You're just asked to mark. These are children aged 11 to 16. So I took a sample of those canvases, and I wanted to see if I could see any similar geometrical patterns and mandalas. And lo and behold, they're there in the canvases. And these are from children from, I mean, countries all over the world, Ukraine, Mexico, Africa, everywhere. So these are children with very different geographies, you know, cultural influences, school contexts, but somewhere in there, for some reason, they're being creative, and these patterns are emerging again. So it's just very interesting, and it leads to those questions of knowledge, you know, learned intelligence versus some kind of prior or inner knowledge that's coming through, again, that we dismiss and we don't look at.
In your experience, how does current materialist science explain this sort of extrasensory experiences in children?
Yeah, well, it doesn't.
Do they?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I think it dismisses them as imagination, as it not being real, as it's just because they're children, but it's that just because, and it doesn't give any other explanation for it, because it's that assumption, isn't it, that brain is the producer of subjective experience of consciousness, and that's not a possibility in our physical world. So it's just dismissed, so it doesn't do anything with them. In terms of these kinds of experiences, again, it tends to be approached from, well, there must be something wrong then, you know.
Illness.
There must be
Illness
there's
then.
something going wrong with the machine. Yeah, you know, it's illness, it's illness. And interestingly, you know, in some of my own research studies, there is a higher incidence of reports of these experiences from children who do have medical conditions sometimes. So things like epilepsy, what are the other examples? Just you know, these kinds of conditions that are linked to inflammation in the body, and inflammation that may affect in some ways how the brain operates, which is really interesting. But that doesn't mean that it's the brain that produces consciousness. It could mean the reverse of that. So, for example, thinking now about the research that was conducted on adult psychedelic users, where, you know, that hypothesis was, when people take psychedelics, everything will light up and more things will work, when actually it was the reverse and there was a decrease in brain activity. So if there is a decrease in brain activity with children due to inflammation or other impairments in the brain, you know, is there something similar going on? Is it actually that the brain might be filtering something, you know, rather than producing something as well? And again, we don't know, but in terms of the materialist view, it's just a dysfunction in the brain, and it means, you know, it's not producing this that makes this work, or and children are just hallucinate. Hallucination is a huge word in the medical literature with children. But another interesting thing is, in some of the psychiatry research with children and the psychology research, they're starting to talk about a phenomena called PLEs, psychotic-like experiences. Psychotic-like.
Terrible word,
Yeah,
sorry.
It's terrible, PLEs. They're starting to recognise that a huge part of child populations, especially puberty age, which is quite interesting, who do not have any medical conditions and who are not under some kind of mental health support, are reporting unusual experiences, extrasensory experiences. And because they don't meet the threshold for a medical diagnosis, they don't know what to do with them. So they're just calling them psychotic-like experiences. So that's the best we're going to get from the materialist medical model. But obviously it's not really good enough, and it's not good enough to challenge. It's kind of like they are just taking these experiences, and it's the discourse thing again. It's, we're going to name you in our terms, psychotic-like, because we're going to pull you in and we're going to make sure it's something associated with psychosis, rather than let's explore this, let's look at this in a different way, through a different lens.
Even the label alone is already a problem, isn't it?
Absolutely.
For kids. Whereas if a child is told you experience a psychotic-like episodes, right?
Yeah.
It's, oh my God, I'm a weirdo, right?
It becomes a fact in the world.
Yeah, and then you start, he or she will start positioning himself or seeing in this light.
Yeah. I'm psychotic, or I'm schizophrenic, or whatever. Yeah,
so that's a
because
problem
the
in itself.
experts
I'm
and
a
the
weirdo,
adults
I am not normal. Right?
tell me that, even though my experience and my intuition and you know, my feelings about this may be telling me something different, because the experts and society in general, then I'm wrong. And and there's probably hundreds and thousands of individuals going, I am wrong. And if they come together in some way, then maybe things can change, hopefully.
So I was wondering, to what metaphysical model of nature, of reality, your research or conclusions from your research point towards or suggest? Yeah.
So I think what the research suggests is that, you know, the brain doesn't produce consciousness or subjective experience. And I think that children's experiences, certainly for me, show that. So I land on analytical idealism, and there are several reasons why I do land on analytical idealism as a really good philosophical explanation of the world.
And fairly solid, actually, as well.
Yeah.
Scientifically speaking, solid.
This is one of the reasons. As an academic, writing about these experiences, you want something that's really rigorous and really well thought out, and has a superb argument against something that you are against and that you're trying to challenge. And I'm not a philosopher. So a social scientist will always go to theory and philosophy, and it's a bit like a buffet, and you'll take some of that as a social scientist, take some of that. The other reason for analytical idealism is when I first read some of that philosophy or objective idealism, whichever, immediately I thought about my own experience, and I thought, when I said
as a child, you mean? Your own extrasensory.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So when I said earlier that it was a case of reading spiritual teachers, but then going to look at what's out there scientifically, because I do have a scientific mind as well, and I like that. And
some rational, logical explanation.
I do
right?
like the rational as well, and I needed something to try to position these experiences in a really effective and academic way. And so again, it ticks that box too. But it's certainly from my own experience, I kind of gasped when I first read it, and I thought, wow, this makes so much sense. This makes sense about my own experience in terms of, for analytical idealism, the idea is that reality itself is this field of subjectivity, and that our little sense of self, for example, is actually in itself an experience. It's not the experiencer. And it was that for me that I thought, that's it. That's where I land. And that doesn't mean that everyone else has to land on that, because there's many different philosophical ideas about the world that position consciousness first, really, in that way, as the ontic principle. But for me, it just completely resonated. And again, as a social scientist, as someone who's always looked at language and identity, now consciousness and self, kind of moving, a bit deeper with this and my own academic journey, it's incredible explanatory power. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, in addition to being a social scientist, you describe yourself as a student of philosophy.
A student, absolutely. Still a student.
So,
yeah.
How does your understanding of philosophy support your research, which is actually social sciences, of course? Right?
Yeah. So again, social research and areas of social science, such as critical childhood studies, have kind of always looked a little bit at ontology. So they have always questioned the material and the biological. They've got a history of doing this, but they always, seem to land on constructionism. So it's kind of, they want to know what this is about, but they're still at the level of the epistemic level, of the epistemological level, about that. It's all about the relationality of how things are related to each other, and it still doesn't go quite into that. Yeah, but what is it? But what is it? What is this? So again, when we're doing research projects with people, we just make a clean assumption that this is an individual in the world, and they are part of that social group, and if I ask them questions about their experience, I'm going to get really valid answers. Well, actually, you're not, because you're asking the conceptual sense of self. You're asking the social identity, so you're going to get sets of answers that are filtered through that conditioned lens. And can we really claim that as some kind of epistemological or ontological truth? And if we want to privilege and prioritize what people say, we have to have a really strong argument for that. So does that make sense? So it's like part of this is trying to say, well, we need to ask first, who am I? Instead of us, again, assuming. So for me, ontology is really, really important in social sciences. And even in social research, which is a branch of social science that works really directly in the life world, Habermas called it the life world, you know, with everyday people, to affect change. Because what's the point if we're not changing anything? You know, we can talk about these matters all day and we can say, well, is reality like this or is it like this? And it is so, so important because that's the thing that can instill change. But we also, and we're doing a lot of that in the academic realms, but people on the ground, it's not reaching them whatsoever. You know, they're really, really suffering. And they're really, really suffering because we're living in a material world. And these are individual biological machines and they are trapped as such. You know, so it has to change.
You know what my biggest problem is with materialism? I'll tell you what. Is the following. So people who say, for example, extrasensory experiences in children can only be explained in the context of machine breaking down, right? But the assumption they make is not conscious in my view, right? And there is an ontological assumption there that we are a machine.
Yeah, yeah.
And that drives the rest of the questions and answers and the rest of it. So if you want to be materialist, at least be a conscious materialist. You accept that, right?
Yeah.
And not just go through medical school and this is how we were taught and that's what reality is. And nobody questions it. We just run with it, right?
We don't have time to question it, especially when you're in a job like that. Yeah. It's like the grind, the wheel, it's that. And I think that's a reflection of the mess that we're in as well.
Yeah.
As I said, we're not given time to contemplate. We're in this very fast-paced, competitive, economically driven society where we are not afforded any space to sit back and reflect and think, well, actually, is it like that? And I don't know if you've noticed that, because I think that's part of the problem as well.
I was lucky enough, I had philosophy at university, even though at that time I thought, what a nuisance, I just have to pass it. Honestly, sorry. Sorry to all philosophers out there.
No, but you do, you start to think, well, so what? Because that's all good and well, but when you're working with people and you see and you're very up close to that suffering, we understand that position of, well, so what? But it is important, and I think that's what I was trying to say earlier. Yeah,
I would say everybody should have a philosophy course.
Absolutely.
Or at least a minimum basic, so that at least they can position that model. Where does it belong? Is materialism? Why? What are the alternatives? And we are not doing that, I think.
No,
currently.
And we don't do it in schools either with younger children. So again, we've just wrote a paper actually about this project where we went into school. It was actually with Fred Matzer and the Essentia. This was a bit of a project we did in 2022 or 2023, but we've analysed the data and we've looked at what happened and we've wrote a paper on this, which is really good. In a nutshell, the school now have changed some of their curriculum to allow children to do philosophy. But there's a difference, isn't there, between that taught philosophy, so what you might learn at university in that kind of curriculum, where it will be, no, we're going to choose what philosophy, because that's the other thing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
We're going to tell you what philosophy you have to learn.
Cut all the Plato.
Exactly, and if it doesn't meet our schema of materialism or whatever it is, you know, of our curriculum. But the wonderful thing about children is that they are natural philosophers. You know, and so it's not even about teaching philosophy, you know, with the younger children. It's about, again, affording them a space just to be themselves, to be curious and creative and ask those really big questions that adults will always run away from. You know, as a parent, when your 6-year-old child asks, you know, what will happen when you die? Where will you go when you die? What is dying? You know, all these that we find, again, really uncomfortable because we don't know how to answer them.
Do we know? I mean, we can't answer to ourselves, right?
We can't answer to ourselves. But again, we don't really have any kind of alternative narratives to even begin. Because the other thing as a parent, if you start to tell your child maybe an alternative narrative, you're always feared then that your child might be a social outcast if they have these ideas. So parents have all these fears because, again, of the structure that this is happening in.
Yeah, pressure to conform, especially in school age. It's extreme. Yeah.
The teenagers more so. It's very, very difficult.
I was wondering, what are the main findings and conclusions in your research? How they can, if you just kind of, a couple of points you could summarize, and how do they help us better understand consciousness? And maybe what is consciousness for you? Because we still can't define it.
Of course we can't. And
universally.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the issue, isn't it, with consciousness in terms of it's such a mystery and people define it in so many different ways. I think, was it Galen Strawson who refers to the festival of misunderstandings when we talk about things like consciousness and subjectivity. You know, it's the sea in which we all swim as well. So especially when we're researching with children, we don't go in with a definition. In fact, we go in from the position of not knowing, of, okay, this is a mystery, but it's always about that kind of phenomenal consciousness. So what is it to be like you? What is it to be like me? It's that kind of what is it to be like, and that's the starting point for us. It's very, very, very simple. And that question, what is it like to be me, or who am I? Again, it's that, I mean, who am I is one of the biggest philosophical questions across history. And we're taking that and asking children to ask themselves that question, in a sense. So it is from the mystery position. For me, I think it's self. And I shouldn't define consciousness. I'm not defining consciousness. Let me just put that out there.
I refuse to define consciousness.
I'm not going to define consciousness, but I can't escape from my own experiences, from the philosophical position that I land on, from children's experiences. Whatever this is, it seems to have, some very tight relationality. I'll use a social science word. With self, with subjectivity, with the experiencer and experience. So those would be the key words that I would associate with consciousness. There was another question. Sorry.
How your research conclusions and findings help us better understand consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, again...
How it is to be me, how it is to be you.
How it is to be me, how it is to be you, yeah. Well, in terms of self, I think what children show is that we're certainly not this small individual, little biological self. There seems to be these layers to self almost that we don't pay attention to. Especially in mainstream, especially in schools, and it's really important because they're very much connected to experience. So, for example, like I said earlier around telepathic experiences and how children then have a sense that they are themselves and the other person all at the same time. So it's kind of, you know, I think we're learning about that relationship between experience and self. If there is a relationship, or is it just kind of one thing? And it's really, that's philosophical territory, and I'm not going to go there right now because. But I think we're learning about self, and we're learning about these experiences. I think can let us know more about consciousness. Even though mundane subjective experience is a huge mystery. So we still don't have any scientific explanations how the brain produces those. So, you know, even that's a mystery. But these extrasensory experiences, and especially in how common they are in children, I think they can teach us about time and space. You know, that might be interesting. You know, these kinds of phenomena that we're all thinking about, you know, in relation to reality, I think children are going to be really helpful there, you know, in terms of how their ways of being in the world and how they experience things like time and self. And that will be helpful for us.
Is there new light that you shed on the body-mind problem?
Well, I don't think that my research can shed much light on the body-mind problem, which is a really big problem that cuts across many fields and many areas of inquiry. But essentially, it's the question is how does the mind interact on the body? How might the body interact on the mind? Are these two separate things? Are they the same thing? Are they similar things? And again, it's tying into that mystery of it's the ontological questions again. You know, what is mind and what is matter? I think that the research with children raises these questions. Even if we think outside of my own research and think to Dr. Ian Stevenson, who did loads of research on children and reincarnation, and that's really interesting because he looked at the phenomena of the birthmarks. So children who had significant birthmarks or birth defects were reporting these past life memories. And when the researchers went through the records, their birthmarks corresponded with the injury that they'd sustained. It was kind of how they died. How on earth can a child who remembers a past life carry as well some kind of, you know, mark on the body? How does that work? You know, there has to be some very strong correlation between the mind and body for that to work. I have some ideas about that. And then, you know, again, when we think about reincarnation, that's interesting too, in and of itself. And I know we've not really touched on reincarnation, but for some researchers who look at reincarnation, it's an idea that souls might move to different bodies. But if we're thinking about consciousness or the mind in different ways, and just about the collective consciousness before, for example, you know, is it more a case that children are tapping into something that's already there?
I was wondering, you've done some color cross research with Professor Sarah Durston here. Could you tell a few words about that?
Yes, sure. So the colour cross is a large inflatable tube-like structure that Sarah has been using for quite some time now to do some research around mental health, and it's been used across the Netherlands. And a couple of years ago, Sarah and I started to have some conversations around much of the things that you and I have talked about in this interview. Sarah's her work's very interesting because she's a neuroscientist, and the reason why her work struck me was because she was one of the first child psychiatrists and neuroscientists who was saying, well, actually, you know, what is ADHD, for example, or autism, because we've never found the biological imprint within the brain. Now, that is really important because, again, many children are being diagnosed with autism or ADHD under the premise that it's an actual thing, or that it's actually there, and you know, some children can be medicated too. So I read that and I got very, very excited and contacted Sarah, and she became excited because she was interested in doing more qualitative research to complement her kind of neuroscience laboratory, all this kind of stuff. And she mentioned the colour cross, and then we had an idea, well, can we use this structure to try to explore self and self-development with children? So not just, you know, what is self to you, how do you experience self, but what changes across time in terms of self? So is there anything that changes in terms of self, and is there anything that stays the same? So we have just started this research. It's very, very embryonic. We've used it last year with some teenagers, and that was quite interesting. When you go into the colour cross, it can give you a slight distortion of reality. So it just, you know, you have different perceptions and cognitions. So it's a little bit maybe like a very mild flotation tank for adults, and of course very, very ethical and very safe. So we're playing with this at the minute, and we're trying to figure out how, you know, we can use it to research the nature of self, basically, with children. And we did a little bit yesterday with some younger children. And it was just incredible to watch because, again, I was in observational mode yesterday thinking, well, you know, how can we do this? What can younger children bring to this? What can we learn from them? And what was really interesting is, you know, as they went into the colour cross, they all of a sudden they became so animated, and in each coloured tube, you know, the children were going in, and it was no longer a coloured tube. You know, it was, I'm in space and I'm an astronaut. And this was in the red section. And what's interesting about the red section, it's the worst one. It can make you feel very dizzy if you're standing there too long. So I was thinking, well, is that a sensation of floating and the way that's linked to space and being an astronaut? And then the yellow one, I'm in the sun. And the children were really in the sun. So that level of creativity that just emerged, it just kind of burst out, was really curious and really interesting. So, but you know, we may have more to tell as this goes along, but it's quite new at the minute.
Interesting. You're, of course, a proponent of combining or bringing philosophy into social sciences, or combine the two in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And Sarah also doing a sort of multidisciplinary research in a way. I was wondering if we could explore maybe what are the pros and cons of doing multidisciplinary research in science. Are there more pros and cons, or are they around?
I'm pro all the way for it. I think that in academia we work in silos, and again I have a very good colleague, Professor Kate Adams, who writes about this. And we work in silos where they kind of see it as an epistemic intrusion. So, oh, well, you're social science, so how dare you put your foot into quantum physics? So, you know, and you know, the nature of being human in reality is a huge thing. And I think it takes more than one discipline and more than one field. And if we ever do work it out with our minds, but so I'm all for collaboration and collaborative working, and for me, so I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm really curious about it, and I really want to understand, you know, what might be happening with this mind if a child's having an experience. So that's where Sarah would come in. So we're kind of skill sharing. And for Sarah, it might be, you know, I want to really understand from the perspective of children instead of just measuring children's, you know, neurons and what's happening in the brain, and because that's a lot of Sarah's work. So it's really about skill sharing and bringing our knowledges together. And actually, we've just done this. We've just set up our own research unit, an international research unit at the University of Central Lancashire, where we're kind of co-directing that for that very purpose of exploring consciousness with children, what it means to be me or I, you know, what is child, all these kinds of questions, but from a very multidisciplinary perspective. So I'm all for it. Are there problems with it? Well, we've had none so far, but I'm sure that, like anything, there's always problems with everything. Yeah.
No, I guess the only, let's say, potential pitfall is when somebody becomes too much of a generalist. So you're not an expert in any of the fields.
Exactly.
So
you're
a bit of that and a bit of that, but not really.
We don't want to do absolutely.
So you want to have your base, and from that base you want to explore other or bring perspective from
But that's the skill sharing thing. So you're not becoming a generalist in a sense. So you know, you're recognizing your own academic limits, and you're recognizing that, well, we need this person. Otherwise, we can't look at that in the way that it needs to be approached in a rigorous way. So for me, that's all part of that lovely collaboration. So in academia, we're all competitive. We're all fighting constantly for that pot of money to either keep our job or to enable us to do our research. But it doesn't have to be like that. If we're more cooperative and collaborative, not becoming generalised. So obviously I don't want to be a quantum physics expert, I don't want to be a neuroscience expert, but I want that knowledge, and I want, you know, the key academic people around me who could support my study and vice versa too. So that's how I see that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to explore with you a little bit the question of how can we bring the first person perspective into science or more into science. And of course, probably we need to separate natural sciences from social sciences.
Yeah.
And I would say, yeah, I've completed a PhD program in social sciences as well. And just to share with you, we were given an absolutely, a horrible experiment, I should say, which I hated at that time. I was studying globalization, and we were asked to apply natural sciences to our research projects as an experiment. So we were asked to select variables, assign weight to variables, and then try to explain our research, explore a research question applying that method. And to be honest, the result was absolutely truncated. It had nothing to do with reality.
Yeah.
So we all thought this professor was a crazy man. But today I understand how useful that was. That method which is applied in natural sciences cannot be copy-pasted into social sciences.
Yeah.
Because there the context, the complexity, the interconnectedness, the sheer amount of data is impossible to apply to. But yes, I think we have far more room for subjectivity in social sciences than in natural sciences. Mm-hmm. What's your view?
Yeah, well,
do we need to expand there? Do we need to somehow bring more first-person perspective into social sciences too?
I think there is already lots of first-person perspective in social sciences. I think we've been doing this for quite some time, and what's interesting when you look at the harder sciences, and there's a bit of interest and excitement around the idea of subjective experience, and then you think that, well, actually, because that has been the focus of social science, I think that's what they do focus on.
We say, how do we change the physicalist reductionist paradigm?
I see.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
But do you mean just in the hard sciences?
In sciences, but also how much is it a problem in social sciences? Yeah. Because you're a social scientist, of course.
But I think the biggest problem in the social sciences is the constructionism rather than the physicalism. That's what I mean. I think they've been challenging physicalism for some time, especially in terms of areas such as critical childhood studies, feminist studies. Massively been criticising the physicalist and the biology for a really long time, but it's still at that level of the knowledge. Like they're not asking what it is, though. So they're saying that this doesn't work and reality is not like that, but there's no offering there of an alternative, so to speak. It's like we just don't want to look at it, but we do know that reality might be different for this particular type of woman than for that particular type of man. And for me, that's kind of where it always stays. So I guess my argument is, well, we might need to go a little bit deeper in terms of thinking about ontology and theory in the social sciences. I think for the harder sciences, I may be wrong, I'm not a hard scientist, but there is this sense and this inkling that something is opening there slightly, in the sense of this might be valuable, this might be interesting to look at, in some way.
I'm agreeing with you that in social sciences, reductionism maybe per se is not the biggest problem. No. It is in natural sciences, in physics.
But it's the constructionism that's the issue, because they're kind of saying there is nothing. I don't know. It's just all about discourse and language and relationality. Yeah, but how is that happening? And that question doesn't seem to be considered in social sciences. So I think work to be done on both sides, maybe. And we don't want to see them as sides either, opposing each other. I think that comes back to the idea of collaboration. Why do they need to be, you sit over there and you sit over there? The question should be, well, how can social science complement hard sciences, and how might hard sciences complement social science and come out of this competitive or this epistemic intrusion mentality?
Mm-hmm. You talk in your book about post-materialist science and the post-material world. So what is your vision for that? And what needs to change for us to get there? That's
a really huge question. I think that I think there is change happening in academia, in those kinds of domains and spaces, but it doesn't filter down quick enough. It never filters down into the everyday world of people quick enough. And whether that's because of academic processes where, I mean, sometimes it can take a year to have a paper published, and that's just one article, or to get funding to do particular kinds of research. But the ideas that get spoke about, these ideas are really interrogating the not just the material world, but I think the problems that are associated when we believe the world is physical or material. For example, then all of a sudden we're positioned as these biological machines that break, that are individual. The natural world is a product just for us to use. So there are so many implications with our materialist worldview. But the first thing that needs to happen is that somehow has to filter down into the actual social world. And I mean, a social world in the sense of people's everyday lives, so that if they need healthcare, they're not treated as a biological machine. Let's look at the wholeness of this situation, you know. Then, and if that happened, if we think back to children being just very quickly medicated, and for the most time and most part put on medication that is really not helpful for them in any way. So as a small example, that could be an area of change. I think just changing our starting point about who we are and what all this is will absolutely start to hopefully change how we organise our world. Because the social world is about how we organise our systems and our social world. And regardless, even if we've got constructionism, in that world, it's not even constructionism. Even that's not got down to the ground yet. So we'd have a long way to go. So it needs to come bottom up as well. It needs to come bottom up. So the more that we, everyday people, recognise and question and be philosophers ourselves, you know, and every small change that we make there, I think will also feed into that process of change that's much needed.
Mm-hmm. So the title of your book is Children's Unexplained Experiences in a Post-materialist World: What Children Can Teach Us About the Mystery of Being Human. Could you say a few words about your book and who might it be useful for?
Yeah. The hope is that it would be useful for anyone who is with children, whether you are a parent or a carer, a teacher, someone who works with children. And the offering of the book is just a different perspective, really. You know, these are ideas that we don't have access to in mainstream life, in our jobs, but look at what's happening. It links back to how do we get this more down to the ground, and we have all these incredible ideas that are going on in this emerging scholarship of post-materialist ideas in the philosophy and sciences. And it is that offering of look what's happening here. There are these ideas, and more importantly, these are children's experiences, and this is what children may be trying to convey. So, yeah, hopefully it's a supportive book, and it's a starter for 10 in a sense. It's kind of the start of a conversation, so it doesn't come with ready-made answers about, you know, we have to do this with children or we must do this with children. It's the conversation starter.
I was wondering, because we talk often about extrasensory experiences of children in a negative connotation, negative context, right? Especially when we refer to medical professionals and illnesses. But what are the positive effects of extrasensory experiences in children, and how can they be positively integrated into the fabric of life? What can we learn from other cultures? Maybe in other cultures it's not so critically viewed.
Well, it's not, and that's what's really interesting. So in some indigenous cultures across the world, when children start to have particular kinds of negative experiences, whether it's they've seen someone, or they're hearing voices and all these kinds of experiences that we consider to be really negative, what happens with that child is that the whole community will come around that child and mentor them and support them. And their experience is embedded into this wider cultural narrative of this is okay and this is what this means. And sometimes they're often made the shaman of the village as well, which is a very revered position. So that's a very good outcome. In my own research, we've looked at this in terms of if a child reports a negative experience, and it was really negative and it was nearly frightening, if it was responded to in a particular way, what was the outcome of that experience? So we have done a bit of this in the research, involving parents in the research too. And quite often, what that research shows that if a child reports an experience and it's handled in a way where we just give space to the child, we just listen, we work through the meaning with the child, then ultimately there's well-being associated to that. So one example is there was a little boy who was consistently seeing very large spider-type beings. We'll just say, I don't know what they are, but spider-type beings. And this happened for quite a while, and it was intruding on his daily life because he was always frightened and scared. So, we talked about this in the research, and, his parent reported that, she'd been approaching this from just listening and maybe doing some drawing and just affording that space again. And he started to compare that to Spider-Man, who's a superhero who he really likes. So just that whole process of not fobbing it off, of providing that space for the child to be taken seriously, which is really important, and listened to, it took them on that journey and that process from this is really scary and negative to, well, actually, I might be a bit of a superhero here, and this is okay, and it's okay for me to experience this as well. So,
which nicely links to my next question. What advice would you give to children, parents, and medical professionals when children have spontaneously various extrasensory experiences? And I would imagine advice could be different per category.
I was just going to say, I try not to give advice or tell anyone what to do, because I really appreciate that children are different, but also the relationships between adults and children can be really different. So I think the only thing that I could say to that is just give space and just deeply listen and take it from there. And, look at, as the adult, maybe look at what's coming up in you. So instead of just keep looking at the child, just have a look at what's coming up in you, because that will always kind of determine how you then respond and react. And even if something's really uncomfortable, just keep looking what's happening there, and just give your child or the child you're working with just room to express it and to explore it in a safe and gentle way. But I try, I don't like to give advice for a number of reasons that might not be applicable to another child, for example.
Completely understand. And the medical professionals,
for medical professionals,
what can we tell these people?
Yeah, my own daughter is a medical professional now. Okay. She's a midwife now, and they are incredible medical professionals. They give so much. They work such long hours, and it's really challenging to say, yeah, everything you're thinking, it might not be quite correct. And but just that there's again alternative ideas out there, and sometimes when we do try something different, we might be surprised at the results. But there's fear as well, because we talked about this a little bit earlier, that in a profession and as an academic, it can be really scary to talk about these things. I experienced this myself in 2018 or 17 when I first started. When I said to my university, right, I'm going to research this, it was like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah, and I stuck to it, but it was very scary, and it took a long time for that work to be taken seriously, and then obviously for the work to grow into now what is an international research unit. So it's possible. It's possible.
So it's changing in your view also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
For the better.
Yeah, for the better. Yeah.
Very good. Donna, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.